from the recordings there. Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this evening. We're going to give it about 2 to 3 minutes and just let everyone else pop in.
I didn't bring any fidgets in and I'm kind of regretting it.
Oh no.
It'll be the pen, the old reliable.
Something. There's always something lying around. Great. I can see a good few people kind of just arrived in there to the webinar. We're going to give it another kind of 2 minutes until we start. There's nothing worse when you're kind of halfway through an introduction and then everyone's only just joining.
Oh yeah.
Great. Well, what we might do is might even just start the introduction. And I'm sure if anybody else is joining, they can join, which is great. So welcome everyone this evening. So my name is Niamh. I'm the employment officer here at As I Am. So we have an hour-long webinar by Katie Curley, who's an occupational therapist and clinical director of Horizon Theory, who's going to be discussing executive function. So executive function refers to a set of skills that can empower autistic adults to reach their goals and plan ahead. So during this webinar, Katie is going to be discussing how we can harness our internal functioning easier. There will be Q&A, so there's a Q&A box there available. Katie has said that she's very open to questions throughout. So if you do have questions, do pop them in. And there'll be Q&A at the end as well. Great. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Katie.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Niamh. So Niamh did a wee introduction for me there. So like Niamh said, I'm an occupational therapist and I'm the clinical director of Horizon's Therapy Services in Dundalk. I feel like I probably wrote that incorrectly in my bio, but Horizon's Therapy Services is my practice. I'm multiply neurodivergent myself, so I'm autistic, dyspraxic, and ADHD, and I have sensory processing differences, which I think are just part and parcel of being neurodivergent. I'm passionate about working with neurodivergent people and helping them to be the best and most satisfied version of themselves. My specialty is sensory processing and how that affects meaningful occupation. And while I'm here to talk about executive function, I'm not exactly amazing at it in my personal life, and I will give you some insight into that as we go along. I just thought I'd include a little picture of my autistic child self here, just as I guess an icebreaker. So you may be able to see I'm wearing a little NASA jumpsuit here. I insisted on wearing that everywhere for a while. It velcroed up the back. It was not clothes. It was a costume. So blending that with a hairband and some makeup, I was always one for blending my special interests, and they rarely matched up. But anyway, I'm sure some of you can relate to that. So today we're going to be talking about executive function, and it's talked about a lot, and a lot of the time it's not very clear what it is, and that's likely because it's not one thing, it's several things, and it's quite complicated, really hard to pin down, and people like to talk about it, especially for neurodivergent people, as being something we're not good at, and I'm going to explain why that might be a little bit problematic as we go through our information this evening. So it's often referred to as the management system of the brain. So it does a lot of organization for us, prioritization, time management, that sort of stuff. For neurodivergent people, it tends to be different. And I really want to highlight the word different, not wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it typically looks like, how a lot of us might experience it, and how we can kind of make the most of all the good stuff we do have. So it's really hard to define. So it's a set of complex cognitive skills that we use for some of these things, like controlling our behavior, reaching our goals, making plans, self-control, following multiple part directions, and staying focused despite distractions. So I know personally, I absolutely struggle with most of these, but I have found some workarounds that work for me. I think it's important to be flexible about what works for you and to be open to trial and error as well. Some things will work and some things won't. And some things will work some of the time, but not all of the time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So lots of things that humans do don't actually require executive function. So anything that we do automatically is not an executive function. So an example of that might be if you were walking down the street and a car mounted the footpath towards you, your reflex or your impulse would be to jump out of the way. That's not an executive function. That's something else. And that's something that happens much more quickly than an executive function does. So anything that requires conscious thought, time management, decision-making, storing information, manipulating that information and working with it over time is executive function. So these are the executive functions. So working memory, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we go on, self-regulation, perseverance, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, planning and prioritization, time management, organization, and metacognition. So there's quite a few of them. Some lists give different amounts, but this is kind of the standard list of what the executive functions are. So I'm going to touch on self-regulation sort of throughout. I don't know if any of you attended my self-regulation workshop, as I am in November, but we were talking a lot about the impact of the environment and how it's maybe unfair to expect us to regulate when the environment is dysregulating. And I also just want to make a little note of that sort of ability to regulate our emotions and to regulate our responses is tricky when the environment doesn't enable it for us. And I will talk a lot about the environment because it is a big factor in human existence, not just for autistic people. So these are the skills or some of the skills that executive function is responsible for. So stuff like paying attention, organizing, planning, and prioritizing. Starting a task and actually staying focused until the end. So completing a task and not getting distracted while the task is actually occurring or starting another task in the middle of it. And I know I personally find that hard. And sometimes I've kind of come to accept the fact that I might start multiple tasks and finish them in different timeframes. And I've kind of learned how to be okay with that most of the time. It isn't all of the time. Other things that executive function is responsible for is understanding different points of view. So this comes under the umbrella of cognitive flexibility. So that might include being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And, you know, us autistics get blamed an awful lot for not being able to do this when the opposite is also true. If you're familiar with the double empathy problem, where neurotypicals equally don't understand us, and communication is actually a two-way process. So it's quite unfair to put all of the difficulties onto us. Another aspect is regulating emotions, which I did mention, and then self-monitoring, so keeping track of what you're doing. So funny experience from my childhood where self-monitoring didn't happen a lot in my house. One of my parents used to put the groceries away, and sometimes I would find, for example, dog food, like a can of dog food in the fridge, or I might find peanut butter in the garage, because of the tendency to not keep track of what was happening when it was happening. So I used to find that really confusing, but I also found it completely hilarious. As an adult, I find it less funny because I sometimes do it too. So one of the things that is part of executive function, or part of, our work in memory, is to chunk things into smaller chunks, I suppose. So this is a helpful way to look at executive function overall, is that there's three main areas. So the first one being work in memory, the second one being cognitive flexibility, and the third one being inhibitory control. So work in memory is something we talk about a lot. And if you look up work in memory, you'll probably find lots of places where they talk about neurodivergent people not being very good at this, which is not ideal. Work in memory is a lot shorter than the average person seems to think it is. Like, it depends on who you're reading, but some people say working memory is a matter of seconds, and some people say it's a few minutes, but it is not a long time. Short-term memory is really brief. So it's designed to hold information for a short time while we actually use it. So for example, if someone says to you, I need to put in this PIN into my phone, for example, can you remember that for a few seconds? That would be working memory. The other thing that we do with it is that we manipulate it. So the information is flexible while we hold on to it, and then it disappears when we're done. So usually it holds about 4 items of information at a time. It can be more or less depending on the individual. And sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we chunk it. So we put it into smaller or bigger chunks, but then we end up with a shorter list. So example, if we have to remember 12 items and some of them have things in common, we might be more likely to chunk them into 3 or 4 items, like I just did with executive function, and the fact that I had 9 items and I chunked it into 3. So new information in the working memory is temporary. It doesn't stay. So if it stays, that means it's encoded into the long-term memory. Or what usually happens if we're not continuing to hold on to it is that it gets replaced or it decays. So a funny thing about short-term memory or working memory is sometimes things do get encoded into our long-term memory and we don't always choose what they are. For example, some things are designed to kind of go past the working memory and into our longer-term memory. And I really find this with things that I find stimmy, like for example, jingles on an ad that I heard one time. I might repeat it over and over and over, and then there it is in my long-term memory forever. So for example, today I had the landing music from the Ryanair planes in my head all day, and it was driving me mad. But that was obviously something I heard a long time ago and got stuck in my brain. So an interesting thing about autistic people is that our synaptic pruning is different. And this is something that in a typical neurotypical research fashion was it was communicated as a negative. The article that I read, the title basically said that autistic people are less efficient at pruning their synapses. And initially I was kind of like, what does this mean? And when I read the article, and I read several others since, it transpired that what it means is that we're more likely to retain synapses and therefore long-term information. So we're more likely to remember things in terms of facts, knowledge, information, that sort of stuff. Imagine portraying that as a negative thing, but it was. So our short-term memory can sometimes be a little less reliable than our longer-term memory. So according to Baddeley, I think I'm saying that right, but I'm not 100%, that there are 4 types of working memory. So the first one is the phonological loop. So that is where you remember something that you heard. So where it's sort of, you know, again, if someone says you can remember this list of numbers, you might say it over and over in your head because you've just heard it. The other thing is the visual spatial sketchpad. So that in your mind is when you sort of have visual and spatial information and you can almost manipulate it visually in your mind. Then the central executive kind of blends all of these and kind of decides what they do, where they go, how they work. And the episodic buffer is the bridge between short-term and long-term memory. So these all function separately and they process information used by the memory. So working memory, while it's short, it's actually quite complex. So another area of executive function is cognitive flexibility. So this is the ability to adapt to new, changing, or unplanned events. And it's the ability to switch or to do task switching. And some of us struggle with this. And I know I absolutely am very varied in my ability to task switch. Sometimes I can't stop switching and sometimes I can't switch at all. So it can be hard to harness. Cognitive flexibility also allows us to adjust to changing demands and circumstances. An example where this pops up for a lot of neurodivergent people, myself included, is in a conversation where there's several people talking on a topic, and I have something I want to say related to the topic, and then all of a sudden the conversation changes and I didn't get to say the thing I wanted to say. I can find it hard then to switch to what the new conversation topic is. And sometimes I can find that I'm annoyed about it as well because I missed an opportunity to say something that felt important to me. So cognitive flexibility is something that allows us to make that switch. Now we can be flexible in other ways. I am flexible when demands change. I find it does take a toll on me over time though. And often autistic people are talked about as if we are not flexible, as if we are rigid. And while that is true to an extent, there's also a rigidity in how we're treated and also in what's expected of us. And often we're not met halfway and there's no compromise. So I think it's unfair to say that cognitive flexibility is just our problem, because it isn't. Inhibitory control was the other aspect of executive function I wanted to talk about. So this is including response inhibition. So going back to that conversation where the topic changed really quickly, I often find in those scenarios that I need to say what's on my mind really quickly because it might be gone soon. And I find it hard to inhibit that response because I want to get the words out of my mouth. Inhibitory control also includes being able to control your attention, your behavior, your thoughts, and your emotions. And it includes being able to, oh my gosh, I have a typo there, I'm so sorry. It includes being able to overwrite an external distraction or even an internal distraction. A big thing that inhibitory control does for us is it allows us to pause and form a response other than just react. And again, personally, I find this one quite tricky, and I've had to do a lot of sort of reminders for myself to take a breath and to think before I act, or to just do that pause rather than launch straight into a reaction, not a response. And it is genuinely hard for a lot of us. And sometimes this can make us exciting and interesting, and sometimes it can make us like stressed out and anxious and worried, because it can be hard to kind of pump the brakes. I just didn't mention this in my little chunked list, but I just wanted to talk about metacognition for a little minute. So this is thinking about thinking. So it's sort of like reflecting. It's also being able to plan and monitor and assess your understanding and your own performance. It's a critical awareness of thinking and learning, and it's that sort of understanding and awareness of yourself as a learner and a thinker. So noticing your thought patterns, noticing your strengths, noticing your abilities, that sort of stuff is metacognition. And then also being able to reflect on things like, you know, oh, I should change that, or that was good, I should do more of that, that sort of stuff. So executive function is often a work in progress, particularly if you are under the age of 25, and that's just a benchmark. But mainly executive function is very, very fluid in childhood. It keeps developing up until the mid-20s and potentially beyond. As a society, we tend to place a lot of demands on teenagers, including making life choices when executive function is still not fully there. So sometimes in therapy, we refer to a thing called the expectation gap, which is where things that are expected of a person are not reasonable. And a lot of the things that as a culture and as a society that we expect of teenagers actually isn't really reasonable when we consider how developed executive function is for that age group. The other thing is that we need to allow for differences in ability throughout the lifespan and between each other as individuals. Executive function is quite dependent on several other factors, and it's very interlinked with several other things that we go through, including our sensory processing, our previous experiences. Our stress level is a huge factor, our health, our wellness, our trauma, and our emotions. It's really connected to all of these things, and it can get wobbly when those things are not optimal. So it's something to be mindful of, is that it's blended with all these other experiences that humans just have. So difficulties with executive function are often talked about in the context of ADHD or autism or other neurodivergences or even mental health difficulties. If you Google executive function or executive dysfunction, I can guarantee the first few responses you get will be about ADHD and autism. But everyone can struggle with executive function, especially in times of stress. And in general, neurodivergent people do seem to find it different. And there is some questions at the moment about whether it's harder for us because we're more stressed, because our brains work differently. And also, what is dysfunction in this context? Is it fair to say that this is dysfunction when we are talking about diversity of minds? Does it make sense to say that a variance is actually a dysfunction? Because in that context, we are just comparing it to what is considered the norm. And if we're talking about neurodiversity, maybe that's not the right way to talk about it. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sunny Jane Wise, but they are on social media and have a blog called The Lived Experience Educator. Sunny Jane is autistic and ADHD and Australian and is a counsellor. They have some wonderful information. But this is a quote from them that really stuck in my mind, which is that viewing neurodivergent individuals as having executive functioning deficits is incompatible with neurodiversity. And that's an interesting statement, because when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about, you know, diversity of human minds, all kinds of minds, how they're all valid. They're all part of that rich tapestry of being human. So if every brain is different, surely to say that there is a standard for a normal brain is problematic. So if that's true, we can't really have deficits, because a deficit implies that we're lacking something. But neurotypicals aren't actually the ideal. And it also overlooks the fact that we're part of the evolution of humanity, I suppose. So it is important to, well, that's food for thought, I think. But it's also important to ensure that that doesn't mean that people don't struggle. And by talking about neurodiversity and talking about having strengths-based approach to neurodivergent people, we're not saying people don't struggle. We're not saying people don't have challenges, and we're not saying people don't need support. So I want to be really clear about that before we move on. So I'm going to talk about executive function, but I'm not going to talk about executive dysfunction. I will talk about things that might be tricky, and I will talk about things that maybe we can do to support ourselves, or things that can be done for us. So difficulties with executive function can look like procrastination. I do that a lot. Difficulty prioritizing tasks, so knowing what's the most important thing, when to do it, what order to do things in. Forgetting what you just heard or what you just read. Trouble following directions, and panic when rules or routines or expectations change. It can also look like trouble switching focus from one task to another, being emotionally overwhelmed, fixating on things. When I'm stressed, I have a tendency to fixate on things that maybe don't matter, but in that moment feel really important to me. We can have trouble organizing our thoughts. We can have trouble keeping track of our belongings, and we can have trouble with time management. So those are the big ways that difficulty with executive function manifest. So a big thing for me is autistic inertia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And if you're not familiar with it, it is sort of related to the concept of physics inertia. And I spelled inertia wrong. I'm just after seeing that. That's so embarrassing. So apologies for that. I have an extra T there. So autistic inertia is related to the whole concept of inertia, like I said, which is an object in motion stays in motion, to be really simple about it. But when you're doing a task, it can be really hard to stop it and start another one, or it can just be really hard to start. So for me, I often find that I would describe myself as feeling like a block of marble, hence this beautiful statue here of this reclining lady. I don't know if you can see her face, because maybe my face is over it, which feels kind of fitting, but she looks wrecked. So in these scenarios, a lot of us find that we either can't stop the task that we're doing, or we can't start the task that we're supposed to do. And for me, this often manifests itself in hyperfocus, when I can't stop doing something, or in absolute stationary, lying down, not moving moments where I feel like a block of marble and my mind is a hurricane, but my body is doing nothing. And unfortunately, to, you know, people who don't know what they're looking at, it looks very much like I'm being lazy. And this is something that gets slapped on a lot of us when we're stuck. I'm being lazy and I'm not doing anything, even though my mind is in overdrive. And I'm usually also on a guilt trip about why I'm not doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing. So autistic inertia is important when we're talking about executive function, and it is an important thing to be mindful of. And I feel like a lot of the general population have no idea what this is. Another thing I wanted to talk about is time management. It's kind of a funny thing to think about. Like, is it actually possible to manage time? There's some questions about this, and I suppose the experience of time. And as humans, we exist in space and time. It's just where we are in the universe. That's just the dimensions that we have to exist in. So time is fixed in one sense. It is what it is, no matter what we do. Time will happen whether we do anything or not. So can we truly manage it? we can't change time, but we can manage our choices when it comes to using our time. And I'm saying that with the understanding that that's not necessarily easy just because it's possible. In some circumstances, it might be better to set small goals or small plans or small little steps for yourself that allow us to inch forward in manageable chunks. The language around time management often sets us up to fail because there's so much more at play than just time. There's the emotions, there's the context, there's our sensory processing, our exhaustion / energy levels, there's our experiences, all that sort of stuff. And, you know, we exist in a temporal plane. So our temporal experience, our experience of time is really interesting because it can speed up or slow down in our perception depending on what we're doing. So attention tunnels and hyperfocus can alter our perception of time. Time can go really fast when you're experiencing flow, or it can seem to slow down when you're bored. So while we can't change time, we do have differences in our perception of it. And, you know, we exist in time. So it is an interesting concept to think of, though, about time management. The words, I know I'm being really pedantic there, but I just find them kind of amusing. So relationships and executive function is something I wanted to touch on. And I feel like this has kind of manifested a lot for me personally as well. I have a tendency to buy gifts and forget to give them to people. My friends used to call my wardrobe Narnia because things would I would buy gifts and put them in there. And I genuinely did buy the gifts, and it's still in my parents' house. I would imagine if I went back, it's probably still full of old gifts, or maybe my parents repurposed them. I don't know. But I had a tendency to do that since I was a teenager. And I do think it made some people fall out with me. But a big thing with relationships and executive function is making plans and following through. Forgetting things like birthdays or anniversaries or, you know, engagements to meet up with somebody, that sort of stuff. Being on time is another factor. I find it really tricky to be on time. I'm always on time for work, but I'm rarely on time for social things. And it's not because I don't care. It's because I know my friends will understand. And, you know, work is obviously more demanding of me. But years ago, I discovered that my friends had a concept called the Katie buffer, which was an extra half hour of time that they built in. So they would always tell me half an hour earlier than the thing was happening, so that I would be on time. And I think the worst thing they ever did was told me about the Katie buffer. So I think now they are actually trying to catch me out with the Katie buffer. And I think it's like 45 minutes to an hour now, depending. But I tend to try and often really just struggle with being on time. Remembering to reply to messages is another thing. If I don't reply to a message there and then, I will forget about it and potentially never reply to it. Same with emails. And I find this really stressful when I don't have time to reply to them, or when I get messages at inconvenient times and I feel pressure to respond straight away. And I find it really bothers me. And I hate when there's a series of questions in one message. I just can't cope with that. Another thing is switching in conversation, which I mentioned earlier. So relationships, you might not think that executive function has an impact, but it really does on maintaining relationships. But people who care about us should understand this, or at least try to. And if they don't understand that this is hard for us, or don't understand how it is hard for us, it's still important that they accept that. And that's part of caring for somebody, is that you accept the things that are hard for them. So it is important that people who care about you at least try to accept that that might be hard. And again, we're not always wrong just because we're different. And this is, again, feeding into the double empathy problem, where we are misunderstood on both sides, or there is a misunderstanding on both sides. So with all that said, can we make it easier? So I think this is something that a lot of people are keen to explore today. So there's some strategies. I'm going to go through more stuff as we keep talking, because these things are sort of like tips and strategies and tricks and advice, that sort of stuff. These things may or may not work for you because these are absolutely context specific, and me giving you a list is passive, not active. So me giving you a list is in some sense meaningless if it doesn't work in your life. So that's the big thing, is do these things work in your life? Do they work for you as a person? Have you tried them already and gone, God, I hate that and I never want to do it again? In which case, that's fine. It's important that we're flexible when it comes to figuring out what works for us. So some things that might work is planning in advance and including breaks in your plans. Now, personally, this does not work for me, but I know people it does work for. If I schedule a break when I'm doing something on my own time, I won't do it. And there's a good chance if I'm into something, I will do it in a hyper focus or an attention tunnel, and I won't take breaks. But I have to be careful afterwards that I do, you know, drink, eat, go to the bathroom, sleep, because I don't do any of that in hyper focus. Predictable routines when possible are good. For me personally, where this manifests is that my ability to sense the passage of an hour is very different at work than it is at home. An hour at work to me feels what I think an hour should feel like, because my time at work is so scheduled and I'm in a predictable routine. At home, all hell breaks loose. I can't tell the difference between a few minutes and an hour unless I am, you know, doing very concrete things. So the passage of time for me is very dependent on where I am, what the routine is, what the structure is, and that could be true for you as well. Writing plans down can be helpful if you're the type of person who will check. It might not be the case, in which case a different strategy is going to be better. Another thing is verbalizing your plan or talking yourself or someone else through the sequence. And the reason that's better than just thinking it is that a thought just can evaporate. So that working memory thing we talked about earlier, you can have a thought, it can manifest in your mind, and it can just disappear. So if you can verbalize the plan or verbalize the action and talk yourself or someone else through the sequence, you have done more. You have involved more parts of your brain. So you are more likely to remember it because you have heard yourself say it. You've made the motor plan of actually forming words. You have actually translated the thought into something tangible like those words. So you have several senses involved here that weren't involved at all in the first place. There was no senses involved in the first place. But when you talked yourself through it, you added in your sense of hearing, your sense of touch by moving your mouth, your sense of proprioception by using the muscles in your face. And you have potentially also communicated to someone else, which can be helpful sometimes. I tend to tell people things I'm doing and tell them you don't have to respond. I just need to say it out loud. I also have a tendency to talk myself through the sequences of my routine in the morning. For example, I am locking the door now so that when I get to work, I don't go, oh crap, did I lock the door? Because I remember telling myself that I did it. Other things can be visual aids or schedules. They work for some people, they don't work for everybody. And you know, the thing that's shoved down every neurodivergent's neck when it comes to organization is, have you just tried a wall planner or a diary or a calendar? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. For some of us it works and for some of us it doesn't. And for some of us, we need to change our strategies because we thrive off of the novelty, especially those of us who are ADHD. Sometimes what happens is a strategy gets boring and we start to look through it and we start to develop that inattentive blindness, which is where we can have something right in front of our eyes and not truly see it, in which case having a reminder in front of you doesn't do anything. So something that I kind of like sometimes when I'm conscious or cognitive enough to do a sort of a conscious decision making is the Eisenhower decision matrix. So it divides your tasks or your demands into 4 different areas. So one is important and urgent, in which case, if you can, do it now. The other one is important but not urgent. So that is maybe deciding a time to do it later. Not important but urgent might be that you can delegate it for somebody else to do it. Not important and not urgent, just don't bother, delete it, get rid of it. And I like this as well because I tend to remember like assonance here, so, or alliteration. So do, decide, delegate, delete. I find that my brain holds that quite nicely, which is good for me. A big thing I wanted to talk about, and I have kind of touched on, is that we exist in a context. So that whole, you know, trope of no man is an island is true. We're all existing in the world in a context, surrounded by an environment, surrounded by people in the environment, surrounded by whatever our experiences are. So it's important to be mindful of what the context is for each person. And that's why I said that a list of strategies actually might not be helpful, because it doesn't take into account what your personal context is. So a big thing about the context that we exist in is the environment. So is the environment a barrier or is it a support to us? And we need to be aware that the environment isn't just physical, it's also social, cultural, and institutional. And we know that all four of those aspects of the environment often don't cater to the autistic or neurodivergent experience. So it's a big deal to think about this. And in some ways, I think we should just wreck the system and start over. But I'd love to think that would happen. A big thing that, is, can you set up your environment to support you? Or can you have your environment be set up to support you? And again, this includes the people in your environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about extended mind in a minute, but I also want to talk about a tweet I saw recently about the ADHD experience of setting everything up in your small space. So you had everything near you. So if you're going to relax, that you have your drink, your phone charger, maybe your whatever else, your snacks that you might have, your blanket, all gathered like a nest. And it brought me back to my teenage years when if I was going to a slumber party, I would be anxious. Sleep was always an issue for me. I didn't really like being in other people's houses. I mostly went to slumber parties out of an absolute fear of missing out. And also, I suppose that the fear that my friends wouldn't like me if I didn't go, or that I would be excluded. So I would go to those slumber parties, but I would always bring the same stuff with me. And my friends used to slag me about this. I would bring a lip balm, I would bring a bottle of water, I would bring a moisturizer, and I would bring my phone charger, all this, and then I put it all under my pillow. I would keep it there for the whole night, and that was my space. So that became a small environment that I could control. It had all the things I needed in it. And as an adult, I still do this. I will often find lip balm under my pillow. I will often find moisturizer under my pillow, just because I keep them there now out of a sort of an environmental support for me, because those are things I tend to want or to need. I also keep glasses of water pretty much everywhere. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Signs, but I'm just like that little girl leaving glasses of water everywhere. And it's partly because I forget them, but it also means if I need a drink, I am less likely to bother to go to the kitchen to get myself a drink than I am to pick up a glass if it's near me. So in ways, my environment actually supports me like that. Another component, though, is that since I live with my partner, who is also ADHD, so autistic ADHD blend, and they are very different to me in terms of managing the environment. I find it's really important for me to have things where I can get them without thinking. So for example, if I'm cooking, I tend to have everything in the same place. I don't need to think about it, but they move stuff around a lot and without really even realizing. And that's part of their, like, the lack of dopamine and putting away the groceries. So I find I get really frustrated. Like, for example, yesterday I found a bottle of balsamic vinegar in the medicine cabinet because it was in a square bottle. So yeah, but I needed it earlier and couldn't find it. So it is important to communicate your preferences as well and to find a compromise somewhere. I actually have tried to label things now so that they all have a home, and it's somewhat working, but also not completely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about extended mind on that context. So this is Andy Clark over here. Andy Clark and David Chalmer have a lot of work on the concept of 4E cognition. And part of 4E cognition is the extended mind. So that is the theory of, does cognition actually happen outside of the head? So in which case we need to be mindful of our environments. So I just want you to take a little second and think about your phone. If someone stole your phone, how would you cope? Would you have just lost a phone, or would you have lost more than that? Have you lost part of your memory there? Have you lost part of your organizational skills? Have you lost a little bit of yourself maybe? Our phones have become quite a big bit, of our extended mind, but there are lower tech versions of this as well. For example, what I said earlier about having the lip balm under the pillow, that's my extended mind. So where I am outsourcing some of my thought processes to my environment. And autistic people tend to be really good at this. A lot of my autistic clients show me pictures of their environments and how they've organized them. And I'm always so fascinated to see how specific things can be. Another thing to think about, apart from the phone being stolen, is if you have a space that's yours, like your bedroom, your house, and someone else comes in and arranges it and tidies it, how do you feel about it then? Does it distress you? Does it dysregulate you? Does it make your daily functioning harder? Do you know where things are now? So sometimes our environment is, well, actually always our environment is a big part here. So if we can structure our environments and set it up to support us, that's really beneficial. And again, this might include the people in our environment. It might include saying to people, hey, listen, I don't want you to touch my stuff because it actually really throws me off. Or I need you to remember where this thing goes, because when it's not there, I can't find it. And that really messes up my routine. And this is especially true if you have a routine where maybe you need to leave the house in the morning and things aren't where you expect them to be. So it's sort of like a routine is predictable, right? It's something you do over and over. It is something that you can rely on. So if your routine starts to get disrupted by the environment, then your life is going to get harder, and being able to manage your stress and function levels is going to be harder as well. So David or Andy Clark has some great videos on YouTube. I would highly recommend checking them out. He's a great speaker, and they're short, but also I get real neurodivergent vibes off Andy. I mean, look at that majestic shirt. I could not see that on a neurotypical, but yeah, Andy Clark and David Chalmer, highly recommend checking them out. And Carolyn Baum is an OT in America. She was the former head of the American Occupational Therapy Association, and she talked a lot about her clients organizing their environments. She specifically was talking about clients with dementia who were using post-it notes or having things arranged in places so that they didn't seem to have any difficulties functioning in their environments. So again, this goes back to, does our environment enable us, or does it actually cause us to have barriers? So this is something from my house. I feel a little bit vulnerable sharing it because it's a mess, but this is part of my extended mind and my partner's extended mind. So without this, we don't really function as a household. So everything gets put up here, and everything that we need to remember is kind of categorized. So we have the meal plan for the week, we have the to-do list for the week, groceries, bills, and then the big boxes, longer term stuff and things I need to remember. And the reason there's so many colors on it is because if it's all one color, I won't read it. Sometimes I illustrate it. It's quite boring at the moment, but we have illustrated it several times in the past, again, just to kind of keep the novelty going. Our initial kind of reaction to having this in the house was that we should hide it and put it somewhere that visitors wouldn't see. But then also I wouldn't see it, and neither would my partner, so there was no point. So we got over the sort of the sense of this isn't a normal thing, and decided, who cares what normal is? This is the way our household functions. So this is part of my extended mind. This is another thing from my own environment as well. This is another thing that is my extended mind maybe not working so well. So I've left these pictures and these books here to remind myself to hang them up. I haven't done it, and I have not bought a bookshelf. So they've been there for, I don't want to tell you how many months they've been there for, because that's more than they should be. But a big thing for me is environmental nudges. So if they're out of sight, they are absolutely out of mind. So the fact that they're there, now that I photographed them as well, I might be more likely to do something. But I look at them quite regularly and say, oh God, I should do this. And again, I haven't done it, but I know I will. So again, sometimes we call these environmental nudges. So another example of that might be if you wanted to cycle more often, maybe you would put your bike by the door rather than have it be a whole rigmarole where you have to go to the garage, unlock the garage, get your bike out, all that sort of stuff. So you kind of streamline your process. And people in tech talk about the user experience. If you have to do several clicks to find information, you're not going to find that information. So you need to have it be readily available. So similar for those of us who find remembering tasks tricky, it might be helpful to have things be out and visible. So yeah, there's one example. So I wanted to talk briefly about support at work as well. There is support that you are, legally entitled to under the Employment Equality Acts. How much you're willing to disclose to your employer is entirely up to you. And is your workplace supportive is actually quite a big deal. And that can be the culture as well as the actual physical environment, and as well as stuff like, accommodations and supports that you can have. And you do have a right to request reasonable accommodation. So it is important to know what you're entitled to, and also be able to advocate for yourself, which is quite a big thing. I think a lot of people find that hard, but it is important that we are able to say, listen, I need this. I'm going to talk about a concept I call hurricane housework now. So most people, when they do a task, they do it sequentially. So they do one step after the other. And for me, that's just not the way things go. So I'm sure you've all seen videos on TikTok or Instagram of people, joking about how distracted they get. And most of these people are neurodivergent. So maybe picking up the laundry basket in the bedroom and heading to the kitchen. And on the way, you see, you see that there's no toilet roll. So you put down the basket and you go get toilet roll. And on the way to the toilet roll storage place, whatever, you see that the floor needs to be swept. So you go get the sweeping brush and you've kind of picked bits and pieces up the whole way. And for me, I call this hurricane housework because I've discovered that doing a task sequentially, it just won't work for me. I can't seem to do it. But if I do things simultaneously and start several things at once, I don't do it on purpose. This just happens. They seem to get done, or at least they get partly done. And I think a thing, if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing partially. Sometimes things don't have to be perfect and we can get stuck on trying to do things right. And sometimes it's better to have, you know, a little bit of the floor swept than none of the floor swept. So it's kind of letting go of that sort of, I guess, that demand or that perception that things should be done 100% all the time. And that's maybe not true, and it's maybe not reasonable, especially when we consider that if you're working full time, you are also trying to run a household. Like, life was never designed to be that way. You know, working a full-time job is actually an incredible demand on your time. It's an incredible demand on your energy. So being able to do housework on top of that is actually another incredible demand. So it's okay to find it hard, and it's okay to be gentle with yourself, and it's okay to let it not be perfect. Another concept that is useful is body doubling. So this is often talked about in the ADHD community. So this is the idea that you do something with another person present. And it doesn't mean that you're doing things together or even that you're helping each other. It just means that there's another person there. And for a lot of us, we find this makes it easier to do things that we're trying to get done. So as a teenager, my room was often chaotic and I wanted it to be pristine. But, you know, the two sides of my brain were not agreeing on this. So in order to tidy my room, which was an utter dopamine vacuum, I would invite a friend over. And I would not want them to help me because I did not want them touching my stuff or moving my things, but I just wanted them to be there. I just wanted the company, and that would mean that I would get my room done completely. I did that up until my 20s. And even now as an adult, sharing a life with another neurodivergent person, we have found that body doubling the chores makes it much more likely that the chores get done, that they get done well, and that it's not an absolute misery to do them. Now, if you don't have another person you can use for body doubling, podcasts are good. So are YouTube videos. I tend to watch a lot of very boring ASMR videos of people talking about like their Aldi haul or something that I don't care about, but it's just enough background stimulation for me to focus a little better on what I'm trying to do so that I can get it done. So body doubling, if it works for you, great. And if you don't have another person, there are ways around it. Like I said, YouTube, podcasts, videos, whatever works. So background stimulation or music is another one too, just to raise the dopamine a little bit so that you're not, you know, suffering the entire time and wishing it was over. Sometimes little scripts are helpful as well. So these don't always work. And to be honest, I have to say that sometimes that if it takes less than 5 minutes, I can do it now script. I just ignore it unless I'm really motivated to do it or unless I really want to do it. The one that works for me the most is might as well. So I washed one dish, I might as well do more. I did that for 5 minutes. I might as well do it for 10 minutes. I started sorting out the laundry. I might as well put on another load. So I do find this works quite well for me. And I think the reason this one works for me is because of my autistic inertia. Once I start moving, once I'm in motion, I can stay in motion. But getting started is the hard part for me. Another thing sometimes is this is for future me. So I'm doing this so that future me has a nicer time or is less stressed. That again, it doesn't always work. It only works sometimes. For me, I find this one is helpful if I'm batch cooking at the weekend or if I'm doing something in terms of like managing like my clothes for the week, that sort of stuff, or even at nighttime. I tend to try and, you know, do things for morning version of me because morning version of me is a mess. Let's be real. Other things is to coach yourself through it. So maybe talk yourself through it, or maybe talk yourself through what all the steps are. For example, maybe you want to have a friend over to visit. Maybe you have to tell yourself, right, so to do that, I have to make a plan. I have to see what time I'm available and then see if they're available. So the first thing I need to do is come up with a time. Okay, cool. Now I need to come up with a plan. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to chat? Am I going to have tea, coffee, drinks? dinner, that sort of stuff. And then you can kind of start to build your plan there, but you coach yourself through this by asking yourself questions. So what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? There is a method sometimes OTs use called goal, plan, do, check. Oh, sorry, those are the words. It's called the co-op approach, which is cognitive orientation to occupational performance. Big mouthy way of describing a coaching technique. But the 4 words to remember are goal. So what do you need to do? Or what are you trying to do? What's your goal? What do you want to happen? Plan. How are you going to reach that goal? So what are all the steps you need to do? Then do. So you do your plan and then you check, did your plan work? If it didn't work, why not? Do you need to try it again? Do you need to change it? Do you need a different plan altogether? So that way you're sort of reflecting and you're able to coach yourself through all the steps. I find that one quite helpful for me when it comes to tasks that I'm unfamiliar with or things that have multiple parts. Another thing is to try and be specific in your wording. So rather than, oh, I'm going to go clean the kitchen, it might be the sink in the kitchen is full of dishes. I'm going to go wash them. So that gives you a specific task rather than the whole enormous task in front of you, like the mountain of having to clean the kitchen. So being specific can actually be helpful. And it's also okay to have the thing you're specific about be small. So using tech as well is helpful. Reminders on your phone, calendar apps, that sort of stuff. There's lots of apps available to help us with executive function. And then again, this also becomes our extended mind that I talked about earlier. So our phones can do a lot of this for us. Doesn't always mean it works. It's not always flawless, but it's just an option. And the more options you have, the more likely you are to succeed. So a few other things I just wanted to touch on where that hyperfocus can be a gift. It can also be a tough experience to get out of. Like I mentioned before, I find it really tricky in terms of eating, drinking, going to the bathroom, that sort of stuff. When I'm in hyperfocus, I don't do any of those things, but I get a lot done. And sometimes I absolutely want my hyperfocus to just continue until the thing is done. Now, for me, unfortunately, hyperfocus often kicks in late at night when I should be in bed. And I find it really, I don't hyperfocus so well during the day. But self-care is also important. So I do, like I mentioned before, tend to have things in my environment, for example, glasses of water in places. Like I have a glass of water usually in every room of the house. It's ideal if you can have it be in reaching distance, but you don't always have the ability to predict where you're going to be and what you're going to do. But it is helpful to have things available so that you can do your self-care. So, you know, this balance of eat, sleep, relax, play is important as well, on top of all the stuff you might need to do to be productive. And we need to be careful with burnout. We're prone to burnout. And sometimes it's not something we can avoid. It's something that we need to be prepared for, and we need to see maybe it's part of our cycle. And maybe being prepared for it means that we have a plan for how do we cope with it? How do we recover? How do we make it shorter and less intense? What are the things we do to mind ourselves when burnout is happening? Another thing is autonomy and perceived demand. So I don't love the term pathological demand avoidance, obviously, because it's so rude, but I do love the term persistent drive for autonomy. I also feel like what human doesn't want autonomy. Surely most of us want to be self-driven and self-determined. So those of us who have that PDA profile can find imposed schedules really difficult and really demanding, even if they're imposed by ourselves. So as a teenager, I'm lying if I say that I made study plans. I don't even know why I was going to try and say that. My best friend used to make me study plans. But she would talk me through them first and I'd be like, yeah, cool, I'll definitely do that. And then she'd give me the plan and I'd be like, no, never looking at that again. It was an imposed schedule. No, thank you. And I couldn't tell myself I'll work for 45 minutes and then I'll stop, like people say you should, you know, that 45 minutes, take a break, then go again. I could never do that because either I'm doing it or I'm not doing it. I cannot manage that imposed schedule. But bizarrely at work, an imposed schedule works for me. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because I have it visually laid out for me on like a software platform, or if it's just part of my routine now. So it feels all right. And also, I suppose this is my business, so it's a demand that I've imposed on myself. But again, it is a demand. So we do have a lot of demands on us. And again, so some of them are self-imposed and some of them are the demands of work. Some of them are the demands of life and social demands, cultural demands. Some of them are the demands of family and friends. And this can be really hard. So when our autonomy and self-determination are at risk, it makes it really hard for us to actually do executive function because we don't want to. And it's also really, really difficult. So a low demand lifestyle can be good if that works for you. So that's basically reducing all of the stuff that is not essential. And another thing I personally find really helpful is declarative language. Now, I've had to coach people in my life about declarative language. So for example, I told my partner the other day that I was feeling tired and their response was, you should go to bed early. And I was like, well, no kidding. I never thought of that. So that then was a demand. So of course I did not go to bed early. And it wasn't out of spite. It was out of that need for autonomy. So declarative language is where it doesn't follow an instruction or a question, because questions are demands as well. So declarative language is a statement or a declaration that is left there and the person can choose whether to act on it or not. An example I often give in the clinic is if you want someone in your household to go for a walk with you, or you think they should go for a walk, you might say, oh, you should go for a walk, or do you want to go for a walk? In which case the answer might be no, go away, leave me alone, don't ask me again, or whatever it might be. Declarative language reframe of that would be, I'm going for a walk in half an hour and it would be lovely if you joined me. It's up to you. I'll check back in with you in 10 minutes. So you've made something available, but you haven't made it a demand and you've still left choice. So this is a really helpful way to reframe things that are demands. And I've had to coach a lot of people in my life around this so that they are more likely to use declarative language with me. And the other thing is that I tend to model it a lot. I use it a lot with people in my life anyway, because if I want it for me, I should be able to do it for other people. Another thing is fun. It's really important to include fun in your plans, and it's important to prioritize it as well. Like humans are, we're fun-loving creatures, you know, and we have a lot of variety in our occupations. And as an occupational therapist, I see the value in all sorts of occupations, including what we do for work or education, what we do to take care of ourselves or other people, and also what we do for fun and how we relax. It's so important. This is what brings joy to our lives. This is what helps us actually, you know, experience a pleasant life and enjoy our time here. So having fun is really important. If you're all pushed for productivity or all pushed for just self-care and productivity, life gets pretty boring. And I think we tend to lose a lot of the stuff that brings us joy. Joy is really important. So it's also good to prioritize your fun and to be able to say, do you know what, I'm investing this in myself. I'm setting aside time for this. I'm setting aside money for this. I'm choosing things that I want to do. And it also helps us to have that, you know, autonomy thing built up in us so that we are the masters of our own life and we're able to say, I do this because I want to do this, or I'm doing this. For example, maybe I'm doing a job that I don't like, but at least I'm able to do fun stuff because I have money to do that, or I have money to live, or whatever it might be. But the fun, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could literally be, you know, Pokemon on the Pokemon Go or whatever it might be. It could be reading a book. It could be painting. It could be going for a walk. It could be hanging out with your dog. But the fun is so important. And it's so important that we prioritize it as much as we prioritize productivity. So you should be able to choose what is meaningful to you and what matters to you when it comes to executive function. A big thing is to let go of the burdens of societal expectations if you can. I know it's not always possible, but when it's possible, maybe you can do that. It's important to talk to yourself about what do you need, what you want long term, what do you want your life to look like. Those are good things to ask yourself and then to be able to work backwards. A big thing about occupational therapy is that we're supposed to work only with what's meaningful to that person. And sometimes we forget that. And I think a lot of people, if any of you are attending therapy of any description, it's important that you get to choose what's the important bits of it and what you get out of it rather than your therapist. And I suppose on that note, you know, it's important that you get to choose what your life looks like, not what does society say your life should look like, you know? Like I had a thing a while ago that I probably shouldn't have 15 squishmallows on my bed as an adult in their 30s. But I do, because screw that. I just decided that's what I wanted. Now, I didn't acquire them all at once, but it was also letting go of that societal expectation and choosing what I wanted. And it seemed minor. It seems minor, but it actually mattered to me. And it actually makes my home somewhere I feel is mine and doesn't look like a neurotypical home. And I don't want it to, and I wouldn't feel at home if it did. So it's important that you're able to choose what matters to you. And remember, as a neurodivergent person, you're making potentially hundreds more decisions a day than a neurotypical, and that takes energy, and that's exponentially higher if you also have a physical disability or a chronic illness. So you need to be really mindful of how much energy goes into the thought processing, the sensory processing, the emotional processing, all that sort of stuff that other people, the general population, neurotypicals, don't seem to experience. So we're processing things that might be unconscious for others. Maybe we need to look into energy accounting or spoons theory and prioritize, but rest is so important, and it's not okay to let your rest go. You really need to have that to restore yourself. This is, I'm sure you're all familiar with this meme. This is from a book called Hyperbole and a Half. I got real neurodivergent vibes after this book, but doing all the things is definitely something I think some of us are at risk of at least trying to do. And then when you do this, you can't prioritize anything. And when everything is important, in reality, actually nothing is important. So doing all the things, not ideal. Another thing I just wanted to mention was capitalizing on good times and letting bad times go. Now, you may not know when the good times are. They might catch you by surprise, as might the bad times. But when you're feeling good, it's good to do what you can. So maybe in this time frame, you can batch cook, you can catch up on laundry, you can do your chores or your errands, etc. Another thing is, do you have to cook? There's meal services. You can buy food that is, doesn't matter. Whatever works for you, it's fine. A sandwich for dinner is fine. Cereal for dinner is fine. There's no such thing as breakfast, lunch, or dinner food. It's all just food. So I used to get caught up in that. And now I've realized a sandwich for dinner, that nourishes me, that keeps me full. It doesn't require a lot of effort. I don't care. It's fine. So it's okay to downsize. It's okay to be alternative in the way you go about your chores or your errands. And another thing is to allow rest time and factor in the possibility that you might not feel good at another time. So I know when I do cook, I tend to cook twice the amount that I would need, and then I can freeze the other half, and that's there for times when I don't want to bother. Another thing is there a time when you're at your best? I'm really not a morning person, and I no matter how early I get up, the time I just seem to use all the time. I don't know, staring into space, contemplating existence, who knows? Staring at the cat, I don't know. And I also don't really like being around people in the morning. So I tend to get up before anyone else in my house does, so I can have that silent time. But I'm not very productive, and I would be lying to myself if I said I was. So I tend to do as much as I can before I go to bed. I even go so far as to make my breakfast the night before, or at least part make it. Like I might even literally put the bread in the toaster before I go to bed. So I just have to pop the toaster down. At the moment, I'm on a same food kick of smoothies every morning. I make them at night. I put them in the fridge. I have a blender, or those little portable blenders. So I just shove the fruit into it and the yogurt and then the water. And then I press the little button when I get to work, and then I drink it. And there's just minimum effort. I also get my uniform ready for work the night before. I pack my bags. I do as much as I can in those times when I'm actually at my best, because in the morning I am honestly good for nothing. And another thing is, don't be afraid to use shortcuts. I had someone judge me once for buying frozen chopped garlic, and I was like, why would you judge me for that? It makes my life so much easier. I do the same with onions, because those things it just makes my life easier. And I don't have to be as organized and as, on the ball as maybe a neurotypical, because I can just get stuff done. So just remember, you're not a machine. Motivation isn't constant. In fact, it's not realistic to be motivated all the time. I think 70% is fair. Maybe 70% is actually great. Be okay with fluctuations. And I did talk about burnout. It's really a risk for us. Rest is actually part of being productive. And if you're not resting, you can actually, it's helpful to talk to yourself about the fact that if you're putting pressure on yourself to be productive, that resting is part of that cycle. And you don't exist just to be productive anyway. You know, we sometimes talk about the fact that, you know, a lot of neurodivergences are disabling because we live in a capitalist society where certain things are expected of us. So I know there's not an awful lot we can do to change that, but it's good to talk about it. It's good to air it out. It's good to acknowledge it. So the other last thing is to talk to a friend, a peer, a partner, a colleague, a family member, a professional. Share the load, outsource if you can or if you need to, divide and conquer, delegate stuff if you don't need to do it all. So you don't have to do everything yourself if you can. So another thing is, and my final point is to accept yourself as you are. You are who you're meant to be, and guilting yourself or pushing yourself to do things that are really difficult for you don't make executive function easier. They actually make it harder. An executive function is so wobbly when we are stressed out, when we're exhausted, when we're unwell. So self-acceptance is really important and self-care is really important. And then the other things, we can build them when our foundation is a bit more secure. So accepting who you are is really important here too. So that was all I had to say today. I'm very open to questions. I hope I covered stuff that you wanted to hear. If not, please feel free to ask me questions and I can see if anybody, or see if I can answer them.
Katie, thank you so much for that. That was so refreshing.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
So practical as well. There was like bits I was kind of writing down and everything. So thank you so much for that. There was one question that had popped up just around the recording. So it is being recorded right now and it will be shared with all the attendees today. It's always nice to be able to watch it back.
Yes. But yeah, if anybody has questions, do feel free to pop them in now. Another thing is that it's Horizons. We're on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. I'm going through a phase now where I'm not really posting a lot because honestly, I can't be arsed. But I just feel like my executive function right now is maxed out. So social media is not it right now, but I am available in the messages, and I'm the only person that sees them. And we obviously have an email address, info@horizonstherapy.ie, if you want to get in contact with the clinic. That will not be directly to me, but that would be to the clinic. Oh, I have a question. Oh my God, if I cry in public. Thank you so much for that. That's so kind. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm going to go home and cry later.
I might read it out because I'm not sure if all the other people can see the questions, but basically somebody just said it's not a question, but it's the best thing I've watched in a long time, so thank you, which I agree. But I think there is actually a question there.
Thank you. I have another question, which is, my daughter is watching me. She's 14 and wants to know, would you have any idea why she feels like she's in constant burnout when she's not doing anything? I highly imagine that your daughter is doing a lot and not realizing it, or it's not maybe being noticed. Like, even existing as a neurodivergent person in a mini neurotypical world can be exhausting. The school system is very challenging. So if your daughter's attending school, that can be really tough. The school system is based on, I'm going to be controversial here, but I might as well, I've already said stuff. It's based on a thing called the Prussian model of education, which is basically from the Industrial Revolution. So it's all about compliance, conformity, punctuality, and being good at repetitive tasks that your employer might like. So children can find that, especially autistic children can find that really difficult, especially because so many of us are self-determined, or we want to be, and a lot of us are autodidactic learners, which means that we want to learn because of an interest rather than being taught. So another element is that there could be sensory overload, there could be social demands, and if your daughter is fatigued all the time and you can't find another reason, it might be worth having a checkup with your doctor. There's lots of reasons, I suppose, and I'm sorry that your daughter's feeling burnt out. I can relate. It's a horrible feeling. Niamh, did you want to answer that as well?
No, to be honest with you, I think that's exactly it. Do you know what I mean? It is the kind of case of sometimes you don't realize the stuff that you're doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it is the social interaction, the sensory, you know, there's always a lot going on that maybe you don't realize.
Yeah, and it's always very complex as well. Like, we don't actually do just one thing at a time as humans, and as autistic humans we tend to be quite there's more demands on us than there are in neurotypicals, because of cultural, institutional, and societal expectations. I would say as well, maybe talk to the school about what accommodations can be put in place. You know, there are possibilities for rest breaks, sensory breaks, movement breaks, you know, attendance, flexibility, that sort of stuff. I absolutely would talk to the school and see what they are willing to do. And also there are things that they are required to do. So check it out, go talk to them. Okay, I have another question. A mother managing a household, and I wonder, do other people with autism struggle with it? Oh my God, yes, I do. And I have had so many of my clients say it to me that I think it feels very isolating because we don't talk about it enough. And I think it feels really lonely and like we're the only ones struggling, when in reality, a lot of people are. I find, like I said, throughout my webinar, I do find it hard to manage my household. And there's also the burden of, you know, raising children as well. And burden maybe was the wrong word. Responsibility, I suppose, was the word I wanted there. But it is hard, and you need to fill your own cup as well. It's important that you manage to rest, delegate if you can. It might not be possible, I realize that, but the struggle is real, genuinely.
There's another question in the end there as well.
Yeah, metacognition. You mentioned metacognition, which isn't something I've heard of before. Is it the ability to be aware of the way you think and being able to reflect on this? And is this something that's affected by autism and or executive functioning? It's actually considered to be one of the executive functions because it allows us to reflect on things that we think or things that we have learned or ways that we think or ways that we learn. So it is affected by it is an executive function. It's different for autistic people, yes, but I really, again, feel very strongly that it's not wrong, it's just different. Sometimes I think we're more metacognitive than the average person because we are quite reflective, we are very sensitive, we take in a lot more information, you know, sensory information, but also, you know, environmental information, factual information, data, knowledge, all that sort of stuff. And I do feel sometimes that we might actually be more metacognitive than the average person. I could be wrong, but that's my feeling on it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Katie. I just want to mention as well, actually, the different groups that we do here at As I Am. So we actually have teenage groups, and it's just for teenagers to come in and, you know, meet each other with different kind of interests. So, you know, we do like a Lego club, there might be a Minecraft one. So and I know for maybe the parent who was kind of saying about their teenage daughter, if that was something, maybe you're already engaged, but if not, please do get in contact with us. Because I know, you know, a lot of the teenagers have found them really helpful just to be able to be in an environment where they can just be themselves, and especially maybe, you know, have a particular interest. And we also do one for adults as well. So we have like a women's group, we have a men's group, we have employment support as well. So I know, Katie, you mentioned around the kind of, you know, reasonable accommodations in the workplace. So if that is something that somebody's maybe kind of, you know, maybe figuring out around disclosure, that's, you know, a group like that is really helpful as well. So please do get in touch with us. What I can do is, the best person is Jen. Jen actually runs our adult support. So what I'll do is I'll pop Jen's email address just in the chat so everyone can have it. And yeah, best thing to do is just check in if any of the groups are of interest to anyone.
And there's such, just on what Niamh said there, there's such power in being around other autistic people and knowing that you're immersed in a community that gets you. It's so powerful. I remember vividly the first time I was in a room with only autistic people in it, and the feeling that gave me is actually unrivaled.
I know, it's incredible.
Isn't it?
I don't think any other questions there. Great. I know we're kind of a little bit past the time, but I think it was really worth kind of, you know, kind of going through those questions and being able to, you know, go through it all tonight. And we really, really appreciate it, Katie. Thank you so much for your time and for, you know, for everything that you went through. I know people really appreciate it.
Not at all. Yeah, I told you before, Niamh, an excuse to info dump just brings me joy. So I'm delighted that other people found it useful. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Great. I'll stop the recording there.
Lovely. Thank you.
Perfect.